When will the Premier actually start listening to the hospitals, to the doctors, to his own experts, and prevent this province from going into yet another third wave and lockdown?
Why don't you come and join us to support the people of Ontario for once, rather than just sit there and criticize and criticize. You know, it's like listening to nails on a chalkboard, listening to you.
Opposition politicians in Ontario are condemning that remark from Premier Doug Ford, calling it sexist and inappropriate. The woman he said it to is Ontario's NDP leader, Andrea Horwath. Ms. Horwath joins me now. Hi there. Good to see you. Thank you for making the time.
My pleasure, Vashi. Nice to see you too.
I have a lot of questions for you about the province's reopening and things like that, but I do want to start off on those remarks. What were you thinking as you heard the Premier say that?
Well, unfortunately, you know, this Premier seems to go to the worst possible place when he's not happy with trying to be held to with me trying to hold him to account, and that's something that I deal with. At the end of the day, this is really about the people of Ontario, about fighting for them. And if the Premier, can't handle that, then that's his problem. But certainly, I'm going to continue on that fight, and I'm not going to let his his in the mud remarks stop me from doing the work I need to do and that people elected me to do.
Do you think the comment was sexist?
Absolutely. I think there's no doubt about it. But that's who the Premier is. And so, he's going to have to account for his behavior, his values, his beliefs, his words. In the meantime, I want to try to stay focused on, trying to keep Ontario from hitting a third wave of COVID-19 and yet another lockdown.
The Premier's office says the Premier condemns any and all forms of misogyny and sexism. His spokesperson said the Premier had been expressing frustration with your party's approach on working with the government on COVID issues. The opposition's attempt, quote, to turn this into something that it's not is disappointing, especially at a time when the Premier has repeatedly called on the opposition parties to join the government in a Team Ontario approach fighting this pandemic. Your response to that statement?
Well, there's not very much truth in any of it, and there's no excuse for that kind of language, that kind of behavior, and the message that it sends to women and girls around our province. What I can tell you is, unfortunately, last week we provided the government with a number of initiatives, a number of proactive things that we thought would help in the fight against COVID-19, and systematically, one by one, the government has shot them down. So we're here not just to oppose, but to propose, not just to criticize, but to encourage the government to do things differently and not just make the same mistakes that they've made again. Unfortunately, the remarks that you've read out are completely inaccurate. But, again, this is how Doug Ford likes to roll. And unfortunately, that's the Premier that's in place. And we're just going to have to deal with it.
I do have questions on your proposals. Just really quickly, has he or anyone in that party called you to apologize for those remarks?
No, absolutely not. But it's an apology that should be given to everybody in Ontario. Ontario doesn't deserve a Premier that behaves in that disrespectful and sexist way. And I think all of us deserve that apology, not just me.
Okay, on reopening, you have been critical of the provincial government for allowing it to happen. They're characterizing it as a transition. In particular, Peel Region and Toronto officials now are saying, as of today, they'd like to keep the lockdown in place for a few more weeks. The Premier and the government have said that that's possible, that local authorities can ultimately make those decisions. So why do you think the province needs to act on this issue? If local authorities do have the ability to do that, isn't that enough?
No, and in fact, Mr. Ford is trying to shirk his responsibility as the Premier of this province and leaving it to, local authorities when his own experts are telling him that he's going too fast. I mean, this is what Dr. Brown said last week, that in fact this transition is more likely gonna be a transition into into a disaster. I mean, that's not what Mr. Brown said, or Dr. Brown said, but he did say that in the worst case scenario, we could have 16,000 new cases a day. And the government has done nothing to change the scenarios of coming out of lockdown. So we don't have paid sick days for workers. We don't have smaller class sizes. We don't have more assistance and support in long-term care. We don't have some of the fundamental things that we should be putting in place, to be responsible in reopening. And so the same mistakes that the government's made in the past are going to lead us to another lockdown and a spread of those of the virus, particularly with the variants of concern taking hold in Ontario. It's irresponsible, and he shouldn't be relying on on the regional medical officers of health. He should be taking the advice of his own experts. Instead, he's listening to, Costco and Walmart executives. Instead, he's listening to political insiders, and that's not going to help us fight this virus.
It's not entirely true what you've just said, though, Ms. Horwath. There are some changes that have been made coming out of this lockdown, including, for example, a higher level of testing ability for schools, as well as the ability to employ an emergency brake. If, for example, a region is going to see an increase in the cases attributed to new variants or things of that like, right? There is an ability for the government to go back into lockdown, to make things more restrictive if warranted.
On the contrary, Vashi, the assistant medical officer of health yesterday said there is no detail around the emergency brake. So Doug Ford is putting on the gas and doesn't even have an emergency brake in place, has no idea what it looks like. And so, this is not a time for political spin. This is a time to actually be serious about the threat facing Ontarians. The other change he made, he actually changed the gray zone to make it even further opened in terms of people's opportunity
Retail
to
can operate at 25% capacity.
And so is that really the direction that we should be headed? That's not what his experts have said. And when it comes to schools, he's basically downloaded these testing requirements or these testing opportunities to the school boards. There's no provincial plan there. There's nothing at all. It's simply a download of testing that the premier at one point said was going to be a game changer. They haven't changed the game. They've had those tests available for months and months and months on end. And instead of putting a plan together, they're basically telling the school boards that they're on their own. So I really have no confidence whatsoever in this premier or in the way that he's handling the situation. And the trouble with that is people are exhausted, they're tired, and our premier's marching us into another lockdown and really big problems with the third wave.
I guess where I challenge you, and I understand the concerns, and I of course note what the public health officials have said around this, is we just talked to Dr. Bogosh, who yes sits on the vaccine task force, but also said pretty clearly, look, this emergency brake can be effective, that there are uses for it, that there is no reason that everybody has to go back into a lockdown, and that the cautious approach being taken right now, and I'm paraphrasing him, but is not necessarily one that's going to send things into a tailspin. Like that emergency brake, he seemed to highlight as something that is really key to being able to avoid the situation as you describe it. So why is that not enough for you?
Well, there's a couple of things. First, it would be great to know exactly what the emergency brake is. And so I have a lot of respect for Dr. Bogosh. If he can tell me what exactly it is when Dr. Yaffe couldn't do that yesterday, then I'd be really looking forward to hearing it. But look, Doug Ford has proven from day one that he does not know how to act urgently to respond to COVID-19. And whether that's what happened in long-term care, whether that's what's happened in schools, whether that's the fact that we still don't see measures in place that are important to stopping the spread, he has not once acted urgently. So I have very little faith that some emergency brake that's very undefined at this point is somehow going to be used urgently by this premier. Well, call me a skeptic, but I'm basing my position on what we've seen thus far, which is a government that has dragged its feet, has never been able to get ahead of this virus, and as a result, lots of people have lost businesses, lots of people have lost their lives, and Ontario has had to go into very deep, long lockdowns.
Okay, Ms. Horwath, I have to leave it there. Thank you very much for making the time tonight. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, as always, Vashi.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.